Um, so as Jeff mentioned, we the moment that the competition ended in Portland, we got together as a team and we talked and talked and talked and talked about the things that we thought were going well and the things that we started to wonder over time if they could be improved. So we put together an idea of kind of exactly what we thought we could improve and a way that we could test it. And so we called this our pilot program. And so I'll just describe this. This will be a lot of me blabbing, so apologies up front for that, but hopefully it's all interesting stuff. So the motivations for this, because a lot of you don't know very much about the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl, these were the negatives that we saw in the experience overall. Not trying to say that we hated the experience, far from it, but these were things that we noticed. It tended to discourage individual growth and serious discussions at times due to the focus on winning the bowl. We've talked a lot about sports in general, because one of the cases was about ethical sports. Much of a focus on winning a game, as in there can only be one winner. The goal is that a single person is crowned at the end. You end up with an interesting situation where like, imagine this: if you have a bunch of people talking about ethical issues and let's say that they all do a really good job, even a comparable job, then if you stick them into this kind of machine, it's automatically going to pump out one winner and then trickle down from there. In other words, the machine dictates that there must be a disparity in the effort and results of the presentations themselves, when in fact that may not be the case. And while that's recognized in a lot of other sports, and it's a bullet that's just kind of bitten most of the time, the more we thought about it, the less we were sure that this was a bullet that we had to bite with Ethics Bowl. Another problem was that there was a big obfuscation of meta-ethics in general. We ran into this problem a lot of teams we're competing against who were kind of endorsing multiple meta-ethical views that were not complementary. They did not work together, but they were just kind of picking and choosing in a way that would help their case. And that is largely encouraged by the way that the Ethics Bowl is set up. And we think that that might be improved, as well as right now it's a little bit more combative, which works in some circumstances. But the more we've learned about ethics, the more we become convinced that ethics is about cooperation. There's nothing about combativeness or competition that directly translates to being able to have good ethical discussions. Instead, ethics is a kind of intersubjective affair that you're all working to try and come to agreements, because ethics is all about agreements. And so the fact that it doesn't teams, but we mean also cooperation from one team to another team. That is only represented combatively at the moment. And the positives, obviously, of the IEB, as it's called, we just wanted to really highlight this, is that the cases that they have put together are absolutely amazing. It's what makes the whole thing work. Everybody just gets to mull over these cases for months with their teams, and they're so deep and relevant, timely, and they cover such a wide variety of topics. They're really at the heart of this. So this is something that we obviously didn't want to change at all, as well as there's something really powerful about working with a team at your university for a long time together on these cases. And you do all this research, and obviously it's just kind of like team building, and that's always really precious, honestly. And as well as the competition is integrated with the Association for Professional and Practical Ethics, I think I got that right, API, which is a professional organization of both academics and practitioners in the field of applied ethics. And it's just invaluable to have them be associated with it all. So keeping the positives and maybe changing some of the negatives is kind of where this vision came about. One of the things we wanted to emphasize was that it should be possible for any number of people to quote unquote win. Or in other words, that the focus should be more about what kind of real solutions can we, or might it even be possible to come to through this kind of intercollegiate collaboration. And so that should be viewed as winning, rather than trying to say that there's like one team that like won an ethics conversation. And that we could incentivize this winning through deepening the connection with the professional organization. And so the basic thing that functions on over all of this is that we would like to have a kind of collaborative structure that functions in some ways similar to a competition, but it's not focused on the outcome of, coming up with the best team. Instead, it's focused on the outcome of coming up with the best presentation possible. And that presentation could be even presented to the API conference, which usually occurs at the same time. We see a lot of encouragement for that to clear up meta-ethical concerns and encourage this inter-team cooperation we've been talking about, as well as strengthening the API connection, as I mentioned, and obviously making this more about outcomes that are real, which is what we've been talking about the whole time, rather than making the focus solely on, the game itself and winning in that far less meaningful way. So this led us to develop a pilot program. We talked together where we decided that we were going to do a presentation round robin style with anywhere from 3 to 6 teams. We ended up having 3 teams for this pilot. And they each presented a case. And then we had a period afterwards in which we called it our chaotic feedback period, where everyone was able to mill about within the room and just discuss the presentations that were shared in an effort to improve them. Because everyone in the room knew that one of the 3 cases at the end was going to be selected to be presented to you today in this conference. It was a lot of fun. We documented the whole thing, and we obviously have some things that we want to improve on in the future. We're hoping to do a larger pilot of this in the fall with some other teams from Utah that we've been discussing this with. But we want to showcase the results of our collaborative presentation style with you tonight. So the team that you'll be hearing, or not tonight, I guess it's all the afternoon, sorry. So the team that you'll be hearing today is made up of, so I remember we had 3 presenting teams. We actually created a combined team at the end that wasn't any singular one of the teams. So these people all presented on different cases, but because of that feedback period where we're working together, we now have the amalgamated team that you see, and they will present to you this case. And anyway, thank you for listening. I think that covers everything, and we will go on to the presentation with no further ado.
Okay, so I'm doing the introduction. So our case that we chose was freedom of tweets. So I think that most people that spend time on social media have seen or been in an argument on the internet. There are rules, but they don't always have real consequences, and people can say and claim what they want, and on occasion things will escalate, and sometimes people get banned or punished in some way, but it's always temporary. Our discussion today is going to focus on free speech and how we think it should be tolerated on the internet. Recently, there's been significant controversy on and surrounding Twitter about if it's properly supporting and regulating what people say and how they say it, which has been debated across platforms. We wanted to get to the core of the issue, which is less about whether or not moderation should be the solution to regulating speech on the internet, but more about why moderation is necessary altogether, the reasons that cause people to abuse their free speech in the first place, and what kind of behaviors do we want to encourage or discourage in the society. And to answer this question, we wanted to look into the psychological factors involved when we go online, how the ways we think and feel about the people we interact with and influence how we speak to them. And continuing from this, we decided we wanted to focus on how isolationism in America fuels a lot of the hatred that is amplified over social media and possible ways to change people's way of thinking. So for more on this, I'll pass it to Celine. She wants to continue.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. So I'd like to start by talking about the stakeholders that are at risk and that are playing when we're talking about this community that also affects very much how we think and how we perceive the world, as well as how communication is done on a social level. And these are both individuals and groups. Ultimately, there are the people that are tweeting, the grassroots individuals, conglomerate peoples and communities that are going to have different biases towards a certain viewpoint. And what is considered normal within those groups will be different from on an individual level. Then there's also the the system administration as well, and whether that is a community such as Twitter or others that are moderated, such as dating apps or social media platforms, what constitutes proper speech and proper conduct in those communities needs to be something that can be talked about. And then finally, sorry, I already said them. The executives of the company, the people that are benefiting from, also advertisers. That was the one I was missing. And people that are going to be making money from the interactions that are taking place, if that is even something that we want to have taking place at all. And I will pass to Claire Montgomery to go over some further details.
Right. Thank you. In a lot of ways, the crux of our argument rests on the function of social media and how we engage in it. First, we want to start by acknowledging that oftentimes this question of content moderation is framed through the lens of freedom of speech. You know, what should people be allowed to say? How should they be allowed to say it? What should people be reasonably expected to be exposed to as part of people exercising their freedom of speech? We believe that while Twitter is in a lot of ways almost a monolithic, a very large platform, it still doesn't encompass the totality of speech or free speech. So while some of the principles behind free speech are at play, we think that the question of how it should exist in terms of the legal concept of free speech is something we'd for now like to put to the side. We also believe that in terms of these platforms, the current content moderation landscape has arisen out of the competing interests of some of the stakeholders that Celine just talked about. You have the competing interest of, people have things that they want to say and they want to express. And you also have the fact that people, sometimes the same people, would like to have a pleasant experience engaging with these modes of communication. And the fact that ultimately any social media platform, Twitter included, is voluntary to participate in means that there has to be some way to mediate these interests so that people will come and participate on a particular platform like Twitter as opposed to on another one. And so we've had constant changes in moderation policy from all the changes leading up to Elon's purchase of Twitter, and of course, all of the changes afterward, where we've seen a few months out from now that it has resulted in some ways a very different moderation landscape, with some things that have ended up being essentially the same. And so we think that the best way to look at this is actually not through the lens of content moderation specifically, but instead through the lens of how we communicate with other people and how we communicate online. Ultimately, we want communication platforms to work, to function in their ability for us to present our viewpoints to others, but also to, learn and experience the things that other people have to say. Ultimately, that's why a lot of us go, is to hear from other people. And so in a lot of ways, the question of social media is the same question as how do we make communication work generally? And we believe that through that lens, we can look more at this question of what it means to have this kind of communication that we want to have. As was alluded to in the introduction, social media tends to amplify the fact that when you engage with somebody online, you don't have that same immediate response that you do speaking face to face, that this is a real person who I'm talking to, that I'm communicating, with a human being who is important and that matters and that is valued. Of course, there are some people who don't behave this way, even in real life, but I think we can acknowledge that in many ways, the nature of, somebody being a username and a profile picture in some ways makes the problem worse. And so what we want to do is look at the ways we can address how we communicate in society generally, to both communicate in a way that acknowledges other people's humanity, allows communication that functions to have the kind of conversations we need to have in such a way that it doesn't fall entirely on platforms' content moderation teams to figure out how we have this kind of communication work. And so our position essentially is that rather than focusing on content moderation, the best way to tackle this problem is to address the sort of growing social isolation and lack of deep interpersonal relationships that we have in society at large, and that will essentially create a spillover effect, making it easier to have these kind of conversations online. To address some alternative viewpoints, I would like to turn it over to Leslie.
Hi, thank you. So it seems like there's kind of in line with the stakeholders we described in this issue. There's kind of a way of looking at this position in terms of tiers where you have, the base level individuals interacting on social media, and then moderators a level above who have their own set of issues that they're trying to address while managing content. And then we have, the wider social media companies and government at the third level. And it seems like when looking at a solution to this problem, we often have to, I think, kind of think of the level of abstraction that we're coming at from as almost inversely correlated to how we're getting at this, whether it's from the ground up or top down. And I think in this case, we're really looking at things from the perspective of what we can do as individuals interacting on social media. That's kind of our primary focus here. And I think that our goal is sort of to get underneath the issue of what exactly moderation ought to entail, which is kind of circumnavigating the necessary cost analysis in which we're balancing an ideal of free speech and prevention of hate speech through moderation, and kind of advocate for a shift in the way we perceive the people we interact with on the internet. And I think what this implies in this idea of bridging the gap between our words and the voices behind those words, there's, I think, a kind of fear, and this is the main alternate viewpoint I wanted to address, that what we're encouraging is almost a kind of oversensitivity, which is an issue on this internet, which is this idea that when we communicate with people through the screen, there's often a desire, I think, on the part of social media users to distance themselves from what's happening and to, treat it as if it's less important and actually less real. And so in advocating for the inverse, there's almost this fear that we're encouraging a kind of reconnection into the internet in a way that can lead to harm, which is why I think what we need to do is look, past advocating just for increased sensitivity, look at the heart of the issue in our interactions, where what we say on the internet is often representative. Well, it always is representing who we are as people and how we act inside. And what we need to be changing exists on a societal level, even beyond the internet, which is acting in a way that shines a light on this problem that's already ingrained in our structure as it currently stands. And so to kind of continue with this idea, I guess I'll pass it on to work on this.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you to the rest of my teammates for setting me up to talk about some solutions that we have thought about and thought of as a response to this issue with moderation. And we think that the most important step to take is going to be stepping away from social media itself and to look at society as a whole. We are very isolated from each other and tend to not see each other as individuals and not feel the empathy that we normally would. And I think that a solution to this would be high density housing, where we have walkable cities where individuals are able to run into neighbors often and kind of are forced to have relationships with people around them, and to then go out into the world and be able to walk down the street to a grocery store or a restaurant and be able to interact with various different people right then and there, and to be able to, I guess, learn how to deal with being with people again and to lose that sort of anonymity and isolation. And on top of this, we think that this wouldn't solve everything. Of course, there's still a lot more in society that would need to be dealt with. And so we also think that social media should be created in a way that's not necessarily geared towards advertising or money, and especially engagement, trying to get people to like or click things or whatever it is. We think that it should be more focused on spreading like these more diverse ideas, and also kind of preventing the anonymity on the internet that we've allowed to foster itself now at this point. And so to just conclude us, I'll pass to my teammate, Matthew.
Thank you, Timberlyn. First, I just want to thank the rest of my team and just point out how they're great at what they do. And then I especially want to give thanks to Sabrina, since this is her first time ever doing this, and I think she did great. And then, yeah, just to kind of summarize what our view is on this, and I guess to kind of give my bit of experience with the pilot, I just think it's interesting. This case, when we first presented them, was my least favorite. But when I had a chance to talk to, who was it? It was Leslie, Sabrina, and Timberlyn. It became my favorite one. So, and that wasn't really possible with the other way Ethics Bowl is set up. So I just wanted to point that out. I think it's fun. So yeah, our position is basically kind of a ground up one, where we look at users and really just how people interact with each other. And we want to kind of take the good ways we interact with each other in society, where we have empathy for other people and we see them as an actual human being and acknowledge their humanity. And we want to kind of carry that over to the social media space and just kind of cultivate that. And to do that, maybe we could just look at things like high density housing, but just really increasing like our kind of tolerance and for diverse viewpoints, and just trying to understand people as others and accept them in a empathetic sort of way. And yeah, I think that about concludes it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I appreciated Adam's summary of this new pilot approach, which I'm really excited to get in front of the APPE people and some of our colleagues here at the university. I do have a couple of questions, though, about your case, if you could address these. Again, I'm curious about intermediate steps or a path towards your solution. So I do like this idea that we have to somehow overcome our sort of social isolation. We have to cultivate more caring relationships. And I love Timberland's thought that this looks forward to different urban planning, so high density multi-use neighborhoods. That's kind of a distant goal, though. So what would be kind of the intermediate steps to get us to move in that direction to implement your approach here? Any thoughts about that from your team?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. As was, pointed out in Timberland's section regarding solutions, the question of, how we interact and communicate with each other as a society is an issue that touches almost every other facet of, how we live, right? And so in terms of, intermediate steps, while, we create a more, integrated society where we're sort of more naturally encouraged to communicate in this more empathetic way, I don't think there's an intermediate, or at least I don't immediately envision any great intermediate steps in terms of from the top down, how do like social media sites fix this? I think that Leslie touched on this as well as Timberland and Matthew, that the intermediate steps really is that while we try to create the kind of changes that lead people to more naturally engage in this kind of communication, I really think the best approach is on a more individual level, trying to sort of put forth that purposeful effort to foster that kind of communication right before we've set things up in such a way that that becomes more natural, right? It's a matter of sort of like putting that effort in and doing that. And I don't think there's a way to do that through something like content moderation or through like policy and that kind of a thing.
I'd like to kind of follow up with that as well, since there is somewhat of a solution already in place. And I think the issue that we're bumping into here is that there are some social media platforms, for example, Twitter is exactly this, where it's kind of a big bin, and it's, as Elon says, the town square of the internet. There's other social media platforms like the front page of the internet, Reddit, which is much more community organized and might have moderators within that community that have a situated position where they're more able to moderate for that community. And that's done by like a group effort typically. But there are some areas of the internet where it's much more open, and then there's others where it's still open communication. However, you are going to a community of where it can't be considered an echo chamber. You are expecting that you're getting a lot of these, but while you're in this community, we're going to explore this viewpoint. If you have questions, then wonderful. But also it's very good at self-critiquing hostile. With a lot of these communities, bots are a terrible issue where it'll just be like hundreds of spam hate. And it's very easy for those communities to kind of filter that out, where it would be very difficult for a large thing like Twitter, where that can be coming from just the populace, and they might even be viewpoints where they're just airing their laundry. And yeah.
No, thanks. Great responses. I appreciate that. Another question, and this one maybe more of a meta kind of question, but do you think that the social isolation that you talked about and the lack of caring relationships, is that a result of social media, or does social media just reflect this general trend in society? Or do you think that social media is actually causing greater isolation and greater relationship dysfunctions? Or is it just kind of a neutral, indifferent, just reflects what's going on?
Thank you, Jeff. That's a really good question. I think that for the most part, I mean, social media definitely does a great job at reflecting and engaging in these sort of isolations. And I think that it might, to some extent, sort of make it more visible. But I think that it's definitely something that we've kind of already started to foster on our own without social media in general. I think that like isolation, especially in America, has been kind of fostered for the past few hundred years and is being like represented really well on social media. And it also doesn't help that like there's so much greater distance between us as individuals with social media, and the way that social media is set up, it's not a way that enables us to look at them as people. And I think proximity might do a great deal of damage to that as well.
Matthew, did you have a thought?
Yeah. I think a lot of this isolation, I think social media can cause isolation at times when we kind of use, like when it functions as a replacement for kind of engaging with other people. But I think the kind of value of trying to shift social media back to like kind of planning engagement with other people as not a replacement, but just as a tool to like create more engagement with others. But I think that getting out and actually being face to face with people is important, and I don't think social media is a great replacement for that.
I also had a thought, sorry, that I think social media is amplifying these issues that are present in our culture. I think through the connects people, where the more connected we are with each other, the more we're actually interacting with each other, the more the emotional and personal distances are between each other. So in a sense, it's kind of highlighting this issue, but it's also, I think, worsening it. But sorry.
Yeah, I think to give a little bit of a different perspective is that we've talked a lot about the ways it can amplify some of these problems of isolation we have, and that it is currently not set up to foster the kind of communication we would want to see. However, I think it is also worth noting in terms of communicating and forming relationships, the internet and social media has presented both an enormous potential and in some ways realized an ability to form relationships and communicate with people around the world of all different perspectives and cultures that you would never otherwise interact with in your own community. And so given that potential and the fact that the internet and social media can do this, it is certainly not obvious to me that we couldn't arrange things in such a way that it amplifies that rather than some of the more negative aspects. And I think that points to one of the ways in which it doesn't seem that social media can really be to blame so much as the way we are currently engaging with and structuring our use of social media.
Yeah, thank you. Those are some great responses. I think we have time for one more question. This comes from someone in the audience. Is an improvement over the old Ethics Bowl format. What do you think would be the benefits of this new format, where it's not just two teams arguing over a case with a winner and a loser, but teams that sort of cooperate to create a single solution? So thoughts about whether you think this is actually something that could really work and have some real world of consequences, and how it compares to the old model. Any thoughts there?
All right. I'll just hop in here real quick. I know I've gone a few times here, but one of the big improvements I would say is the thing I'm most attracted to is it is a way to have an intercollegiate activity that is not strictly based around the assumption that the only way that universities and university undergraduates want to interact with each other is a competition in which one school can defeat or dominate the other one. To say, you know, we beat this school. I think that I think there is something to, you know, for this sort of competition, but if you were to look at sort of the overall landscape of intercollegiate activities, it would seem that that's the only way, the only thing universities are interested in is competing against and beating other schools. But especially as I've engaged in that, I really don't think that's the case. I think that there is probably an appetite for people to engage with people of other schools to see what they have to say and to work together with them, to collaborate in a way that is really, I think, otherwise missing. And I think that unique angle is something that it could, I would hope, set a model for this idea that intercollegiate activity does not just have to be about competing with and beating other schools, but instead working with other schools. I think that's really exciting.
If I could, I would love to follow up, Claire, with that idea that we're no longer competing now. One thing that I found that it has really helped our teams do as we've kind of gone through these cases is find focuses and strengths that our community will have that maybe others won't be exposed to, and come to the ethical discussion with those cases particularly in mind, knowing that the other people that are going to be looking at these cases as well are going to have completely different viewpoints and are also going to have, there's going to be a bunch of mutually considered points that are looked at from a bunch of different perspectives. And this method of intra-team collaboration on the same way that we do inside of our groups has allowed for us to lean into that almost bias in a way that I find is very fruitful for ethical discussion, especially when we're able to communicate on a person-to-person level. And to me, it's honestly what ethics means, is to be able to do that effectively. And so to be able to have something where that is the actual focus and goal of the communication that you're engaging in is honestly just really beautiful, fun, and refreshing. But also I think it illustrates a hopefulness to ethical frameworks and communication that we really do want to have these discussions and understand and actually come to a mutually agreed upon conclusion, where I think that's largely lost, especially with this case where we just brought up with social media. I like to hope that everyone actually does want what's best for everyone else. And I think that this allows for that optimism to actually be somewhat realized.
Yeah, beautiful responses. Thank you so much, Celine and Claire. I'm glad this is recorded because I want to send those responses to APPE, the national organization, because they were so well articulated. Any other responses before we close the session?
I guess I'll also throw in, I feel like kind of just going along with what Selena's saying, it feels like the conversations end up feeling a whole lot more open-ended with where there's potential for continuing the discussion. I felt like and I feel like I end up thinking a whole lot more deeply about the issues when we're kind of working together to find a solution which accounts for the perspectives of a wider group more than just our own smaller teams.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Appreciate that. Matthew, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I guess I kind of mentioned it in the presentation, but just to hit on again, when I heard at nationals, like other teams' presentations that I didn't love, there wasn't really a chance to go talk to them about it and like further the discussion. But this format really like encourages it, and it's kind of what it's all about. So yeah, it's totally different and something that I think is done way better with this format.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everyone. That was a wonderful session. I loved hearing about the new model, and hopefully we can introduce this on the national stage in the coming months and years. So thanks, everyone. And this will conclude the final session of the Student Ethics Symposium. Thank you to Brian Birch and the Center for the Study of Ethics for hosting this. They always do a fantastic job, and for all of you who watched and participated. So without further ado, we'll just say goodbye.